The photograph landed on my desk with a note clipped to the corner. Thought you might find this interesting. M. M was Marcus Whitfield, a retired RAF intelligence analyst I'd consulted on previous stories. He didn't send things unless they mattered. The image was a reconnaissance photograph taken from high altitude in September 1942. Black and white, grainy from distance and age. It showed a stretch of French countryside near Calais, fields divided by hedgerows, a small village clustered around a church spire, a rail line cutting diagonally through the frame. At first glance, it looked like 1,000 other reconnaissance photos from the war. Strategic terrain, potential targets, standard intelligence gathering. But something was wrong. The hedgerows were too perfect, too geometric. The spacing between them followed a pattern that didn't match natural agricultural divisions. And in 3 separate fields, the crops grew in configurations that made no tactical sense. Circular patches amid rectangular plantings, all oriented the same direction. I called Marcus. "You saw it," he said when he picked up. Not a question. The hedgerows? And the crop patterns? And the shadows near the rail line? He paused. "Look closer at the village. The church." I found a magnifying glass and examined the church more carefully. The roof showed damage. Tiles missing, beams exposed. But the damage was oddly consistent. Too symmetrical. And the shadow it cast at that time of day fell at the wrong angle. "It's not a real church," I said slowly. "No, it's not." "What am I looking at?" "Deception," Marcus said. "One of the most elaborate deception operations of the entire war. And almost no one knows it happened." He told me to look at the rail line again. I did, tracing it across the frame. It appeared to connect 2 distant points, functional and direct. But when I followed it carefully, I noticed something peculiar. The rails didn't quite connect. There were gaps, tiny breaks in the line, barely visible at this resolution, covered by what looked like painted canvas or wood. The entire railway was a facade. "This photograph," Marcus continued, "was taken by an RAF reconnaissance flight in September 1942. The pilot reported nothing unusual. The photo was filed as routine intelligence. But 3 months later, a French resistance operative sent a message to London. 4 words. Calais is a theater. What does that mean? It means everything in this photograph is a lie. The village, the railway, the fields, the church, all constructed, all fake. Built by French forced laborers under German supervision to deceive Allied reconnaissance and photo interpreters. Why? To hide the real strategy. To make us believe something was happening in Calais when the actual preparations were happening elsewhere." He paused. "This photograph is proof that we were looking at an entire landscape designed to trick us. And it worked. For months, it worked." I stared at the image again. An entire false countryside, built to be photographed from above. Fields planted in patterns that suggested military activity. A railway that led nowhere. A church that wasn't a church. "Who figured it out?" I asked. "A woman named Claire Delacroix. She was part of the local resistance. Her family farm was requisitioned to build part of this deception site. She watched them construct it, and she risked her life to tell London what she saw." "Is she still alive?" "No. She died in 1987, but her granddaughter lives in Paris. She has Claire's wartime journals. If you want to know the full story, that's where you need to start." I booked a flight to Paris the next day. Claire's granddaughter, Marie Delacroix, met me at a cafe in the Marais. She was a historian herself in her 50s, with her grandmother's sharp eyes and careful manner. "My grandmother never spoke about the war when I was young," Marie said as we sat down. "It wasn't until I was in university studying history that she finally told me what she'd done. By then she was in her 70s. She said she'd kept silent because she didn't want to be seen as a hero. She said heroes were the ones who died. She just did what needed to be done and survived." Marie pulled out a worn leather journal from her bag. "This is from 1942. She wrote in code at first, afraid of being discovered. Later, after the liberation, she translated it herself." I opened the journal carefully. The handwriting was small, precise, dated entries from July through December 1942. July 15, 1942. "They came today. German officers and engineers. They told Papa they were requisitioning the South Fields. For agriculture, they said. But I saw the plans they carried. drawings of buildings that weren't buildings, railways that went nowhere. August 3rd, 1942. The workers arrived. French prisoners mostly, thin and exhausted. They're building something in the fields. Wooden frames covered in canvas, painted to look like real structures from above. A false village rising from nothing. September 12th, 1942. The church is finished. It looks real from the ground, but I climbed the hill yesterday and saw it from above. It's hollow, just a shell with a painted roof. They've even damaged it deliberately, removed tiles, exposed beams, to make it look bombed, as if we've already been attacked. September 28th, 1942. I counted the reconnaissance planes today. 4 passed over between dawn and noon. They're watching us, photographing us, and we're showing them exactly what the Germans want them to see. I looked up at Marie. She understood what was happening. She did, and she knew she had to tell someone. Marie turned to another page. This is from October 14th, 1942. I made contact with the network. It took 3 weeks to find someone I could trust. Tomorrow I leave for the safe house in Lille. I will carry the message myself. London must know that Calais is a deception, that the real preparations are happening elsewhere, that every photograph they take of our fields shows them a lie. Did she make it to Lille? I asked. Yes, she delivered the message to a resistance operative who transmitted it to London via radio. Marie paused. But the Germans were already suspicious. Someone had informed. Claire made it home, but they were watching her. She knew her time was limited. I looked at the reconnaissance photograph again, understanding now what I was seeing. This wasn't just a photograph. It was evidence of an invisible war, fought not with guns and bombs, but with wood and paint and carefully planted crops. A war of perception, where the battlefield was the human eye looking through a camera lens from 20,000 feet. What happened to Claire? I asked. Marie's expression darkened. She was arrested in December 1942, questioned, tortured. She never gave up any names. Her voice dropped. They sent her to Ravensbrück. She survived, barely. Returned to France in 1945 weighing less than 40 kilos. And the deception site? It remained operational until the invasion. The Allies continued to believe Calais was a primary target zone. Resources were diverted, defenses reinforced in the wrong places. Meanwhile, the real invasion preparations happened in Normandy, 200 kilometers west. I thought about the scale of it. An entire false landscape, maintained for years, photographed hundreds of times, never fully understood until it was too late. The message Claire sent, I said. Did London act on it? Marie shook her head slowly. Not immediately. It was considered unreliable. One source, no corroborating intelligence. And by the time other evidence emerged, the deception had already achieved its purpose. Why hasn't this been documented? It was. Fragments exist. But after the war, there was enormous pressure to move forward, to rebuild. Stories like this, they were buried. Literally. When the Allies approached, the factory was evacuated in a single night. The site was set on fire. By the time investigators arrived, there was nothing but ash. I looked at the photograph again. The perfect geometry, the careful deception, the invisible hand of Claire Delacroix standing somewhere in those fields, watching the planes, knowing the truth. This image, Marie said quietly, is proof that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that happen in shadows and silence, the ones fought by people whose names no one remembers. I spent 3 days in Paris going through Claire's journals with Marie's help. The entries were meticulous. Claire had documented everything. The arrival of materials, the construction timeline, the number of workers, even sketches of the false structures being built. She wrote with the precision of someone who understood she was creating a historical record, not just keeping a diary. But one entry kept drawing my attention. November 3rd, 1942. Something changed today. The engineers brought new plans. They're adding another element to the deception, something they call evidence of preparation. Not just false buildings, but false activity, movement that can be seen from above. What followed was a detailed description of what the Germans were constructing. Tracks in the mud that simulated vehicle movement, laundry lines strung between buildings to suggest occupation, even controlled fires lit at specific times to create smoke visible in reconnaissance photographs. They were staging life, I said to Marie. making the fake village look inhabited. More than that, she replied, pointing to another passage. Look at this. November 18th, 1942. Today, they brought shadows. Actual shadows. Long pieces of dark canvas laid on the ground in patterns that match the angle of morning sun. When the reconnaissance planes pass over at dawn, the photographs will show shadows from buildings that don't exist. I felt a chill. They were manipulating light itself, I said. Yes, and Claire recognized immediately how sophisticated this was. This wasn't just camouflage, it was theater. Every element choreographed to create a specific illusion at a specific time of day for a specific observer. I pulled up the 1942 reconnaissance photograph on my laptop and zoomed in on the areas Claire had described. With her journal as a guide, I could now see what I'd missed before. The shadows near the rail line weren't cast by real structures. They were painted, laid flat on the ground, angled precisely to match September morning light. The tire tracks visible in one field followed a pattern too perfect to be natural. They'd been created deliberately, rolled into the mud with weighted drums to simulate heavy vehicle traffic. Even the smoke rising from the village chimneys, I'd assumed it indicated occupation. But Claire's journal noted the fires were lit only when German spotters confirmed reconnaissance flights approaching. Everything in this photograph was performance, and the audience was British photo intelligence. Did Claire understand why they were doing this, I asked. Marie turned to a later entry. December 1st, 1942. I finally understand. They're not just hiding the real preparations. They're creating an entire false narrative, making us believe an invasion will come through Calais. Every resource we devote to defending here is a resource diverted from wherever the real attack will happen. This isn't defense. It's misdirection on a massive scale. She was right, I said. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception before D-Day. But this was the German version running 2 years earlier. Exactly. And no one has ever fully documented it because the operation was buried after the war. The German records were destroyed, the site was dismantled, and the French who witnessed it, Marie trailed off. Most didn't survive. Those who did were often too traumatized to speak. But Claire spoke. Eventually, after decades of silence, I looked at another element in the photograph that had puzzled me from the beginning. The crop patterns, the circular plantings amid rectangular fields. What about these? I asked, pointing. Marie smiled slightly. That was what convinced me my grandmother's story was real. When I first showed this photograph to an agricultural historian, she was baffled. She said those patterns made no sense. No French farmer would plant like that. The circles disrupted irrigation, complicated harvesting, served no agricultural purpose. So why were they there? Claire explains it in her journal. The Germans wanted the fields to show signs of military activity visible from reconnaissance altitude. The circles simulated ground disturbance from artillery emplacements or anti-aircraft positions. Planted with fast-growing crops that would photograph as different shades of gray, they created the illusion of recent construction. I zoomed in on the circles. Now that I knew what they were, I could see the deliberate staging. The spacing was too regular, the size too uniform. Everything in this landscape was designed to be misread, I said. Yes, and the tragedy is that it worked. Claire sent her message. London received it. But the intelligence was buried under contradicting reports, strategic assumptions, and bureaucratic inertia. By the time the truth was fully understood, the deception had already accomplished its goal. I sat back, overwhelmed by the complexity of what I was seeing. This photograph wasn't evidence of what was happening in France in 1942. It was evidence of what the Germans wanted the Allies to believe was happening. Every line, every shadow, every planted field was a carefully constructed lie. And somewhere in that lie, Claire Delacroix had stood, watching, documenting, knowing. I need to find others who witnessed this, I said. There must have been more people who saw what was being built. Marie hesitated. There were, but most are gone now. The workers who built the site were mostly forced laborers. Many died or were sent to camps. The German engineers and officers responsible, she shrugged, dead, disappeared, or silent. But there must be someone. There is one person who might help, a man named Bernard Rousseau. He was 11 years old in 1942. His father worked as a carpenter, conscripted to help build the false structures. Bernard used to bring his father lunch in the fields. He saw everything. Is he still alive? Yes. Living in a care home in Calais. He's 93. His mind is sharp, but... Marie paused. He doesn't like talking about the war. Will he talk to me? I can ask. But you need to understand. These memories are painful. He watched his father beaten for working too slowly. He watched friends' families torn apart. This isn't academic history for him, it's trauma. I understand. Marie made a call. After a long conversation in French, she hung up and nodded. He'll see you. Tomorrow afternoon. But he asks that you bring the photograph. He wants to see it again. The next day, I took a train to Calais. The care home was a converted manor house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by gardens where elderly residents walked slowly in the autumn sun. Bernard Rousseau sat in a wheelchair near a window overlooking the gardens. He was small, thin, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes were clear and sharp when he looked up at me. "You're the journalist," he said in accented English. "Yes. Thank you for seeing me. Marie said you have a photograph." I pulled it out and handed it to him. He held it carefully, studying it for a long moment. Then his hands began to shake. "I remember when they took this," he said quietly. "September 1942. I was in the fields that day, bringing my father his lunch. I heard the plane, high altitude, reconnaissance flight. I looked up and watched it pass. And I remember thinking, they're taking a picture of a lie. You understood what was being built?" I was 11. I understood enough. He pointed to the false church. My father helped build that. It took them 3 weeks. Canvas stretched over wooden frames, painted to look like stone. They even put in fake stained glass, colored paper behind empty windows. He laughed bitterly. I asked my father why. He said, "So when the English look down, they see what the Germans want them to see." Do you remember the woman who tried to warn London? Claire Delacroix. His expression changed. I remember her. She came to our house once, spoke with my father, told him to be careful, that she was going to send a message, and if the Germans found out, anyone connected would be punished. He paused. My father told her not to do it, said it was too dangerous, but she said someone had to. What happened to your father? Bernard was quiet for a long time. He was arrested 2 weeks after Claire. They never charged him with anything, just took him away. We never saw him again. I felt the weight of that silence. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Bernard touched the photograph again. But I've never forgotten. Every line in this image is a lie my father helped build because he had no choice. I left Calais with Bernard's words echoing in my mind, and a growing sense that this photograph held more secrets than anyone had fully documented. Back in London, I contacted the Imperial War Museum's photographic archives. If the RAF had taken this reconnaissance photograph in September 1942, there should be related images, before and after shots, comparative intelligence, analysis reports from the period. The archivist, a methodical woman named Dr. Helen Cartwright, met me in the basement reading room surrounded by metal filing cabinets containing thousands of wartime photographs. Calais, September 1942, she repeated, typing into her database. We have extensive coverage of that region. Reconnaissance flights passed over every few days tracking German coastal defenses and potential invasion sites. She pulled up a series of images on her computer screen. Aerial photographs spanning from July 1942 through June 1944. The progression was startling. In July 1942, the fields near Calais showed normal agricultural patterns. Irregular hedgerows, scattered farm buildings, a genuine village with organic growth patterns. By August, the transformation had begun. Geometric divisions appeared. New structures rose in previously empty fields. September, the photograph I held. The deception nearly complete. And then, month by month through 1943 and into 1944, the false landscape matured. More details added. More evidence of military preparation staged for the cameras overhead. This is extraordinary, Dr. Cartwright said, leaning closer to the screen. I've seen thousands of reconnaissance photographs, but I've never noticed this pattern. It's like watching a stage set being built in slow motion. Did anyone at the time recognize what was happening? She pulled up files from the RAF Intelligence Analysis Division. Let me check the interpretation reports. The reports were typed summaries filed with each photographic sortie. Most were brief, technical, focused on immediate military significance. September 15, 1942. Calais sector showing increased activity. New rail spur construction noted. Village expansion evident. Recommend continued surveillance. October 3, 1942. Calais defensive preparations continuing. Artillery positions visible in field south of village. Troop concentrations probable. November 21, 1942. Significant military buildup Calais region. Railway capacity expanding. Recommend target designation for future operations. They believed it, I said. Every word. Of course they did, Dr. Cartwright replied. Why wouldn't they? This was sophisticated deception. And remember the context. 1942. Germany controlled the French coast. Everyone assumed an Allied invasion would eventually come. Calais was the logical point. Shortest distance to England, proximity to major ports. The intelligence confirmed what strategists already expected to see. She pulled up another file. But look at this. It was a memo dated December 1942, marked Low Priority, Resistance Source. Intelligence received from French resistance operative via Lille network. Source claims Calais military installations are fabricated deception designed to mislead reconnaissance. Source reliability, unconfirmed. Assessment, possible disinformation. German forces have clear strategic interest in defending Calais approach. Observable construction patterns consistent with genuine defensive preparation. Recommendation, file for reference, but do not alter operational assessment. Claire's message, I said. Most likely. It was received, logged, and dismissed, because it contradicted what they wanted to believe. Dr. Cartwright nodded slowly. Confirmation bias. One of the most dangerous traps in intelligence work. When evidence supports your existing theory, you accept it readily. When it contradicts your theory, you question the source. I thought of Claire in her farmhouse watching the reconnaissance planes pass overhead, knowing the truth was being photographed but not understood. Were there other warnings? I asked. Dr. Cartwright searched deeper into the files. A few, scattered reports from resistance sources through 1943 mentioning irregularities in Calais defenses, but nothing concrete enough to override the photographic evidence. And the photographs kept showing exactly what the Germans wanted them to show. She pulled up an image from April 1944, just weeks before D-Day. The false landscape was at its peak. Every element perfected. The village looked lived in. The railway appeared functional. The field showed patterns of military activity. Even the shadows fell in precisely the right places. By this point, Dr. Cartwright said, Allied command had committed significant resources to preparing for a Calais-centered German defense. When the actual invasion came at Normandy, the deception had already served its purpose. German reserves remained concentrated around Calais for crucial days, waiting for an attack that never came. All because of this, I said, touching the photograph. All because of this. I spent the next week tracking down former RAF photo interpreters who had worked during the war. Most were gone, but I found 3 who had analyzed French coastal reconnaissance in the early 1940s. One of them, squadron leader James Patterson, now 97 and living in Sussex, agreed to look at the photograph. We met in his cottage, surrounded by books and framed photographs from his service years. He examined the 1942 image with a magnifying glass, his hands remarkably steady despite his age. I remember these sorties, he said finally. I interpreted hundreds of photographs from this sector, and I never once questioned what I was seeing. How could you have known? We couldn't. That's the point of good deception. It's invisible until someone shows you the seams. He pointed to the hedgerows. Look at this spacing. Perfect geometry. In retrospect, obviously artificial. But when you're looking at dozens of photographs daily, searching for military targets, you don't stop to analyze agricultural patterns. Did you ever see Claire Delacroix's intelligence report? No. Those would have gone to a different department. Human intelligence analysis. Photo interpreters worked in a separate silo. We analyzed what we could see. Others analyzed what informants told them. And rarely did those analyses cross paths effectively. He set down the magnifying glass and looked at me. The hardest lesson I learned in that war wasn't about reading photographs. It was about reading the gaps between photographs, the things we didn't capture, the context we missed, the human voices we didn't hear. He paused. This woman, Claire, she was trying to fill those gaps, to tell us what the photographs couldn't show, and we failed to listen. Why? Because we trusted technology more than testimony. We believed what we could see more than what we were told, and the Germans understood that perfectly. They built a lie visible enough to photograph and plausible enough to believe. I asked him about the technical sophistication of the deception. Remarkable, he said. The Germans had excellent intelligence about our reconnaissance patterns, flight paths, altitudes, camera capabilities, interpretation priorities. They knew exactly what we would photograph and how we would analyze it. So they constructed something that would pass every test we applied. False shadows, staged activity, painted crops. Yes, and the genius was in the consistency. It wasn't just one false element. It was an entire ecosystem of deception. Every component supported every other component. The false railway connected to false stations. The false village showed appropriate damage patterns for a region that had seen combat. The fields displayed crop types consistent with forced German agricultural quotas. He shook his head in admiration. It was theater on a geographic scale, and Claire saw through it because she was there on the ground. Exactly. She had context we lacked. She knew what those fields looked like before. She knew no French farmer planted in circles. She knew that church was hollow. But from 20,000 feet, he gestured at the photograph. From 20,000 feet, it looked real. Before I left, Patterson asked me a question. What happened to her? The woman who tried to warn us? She was arrested, sent to Ravensbrück, survived barely, returned to France after the war and lived quietly until 1987. He was silent for a moment. Did she ever know that we received her message? I don't think so. Then she died believing she'd failed. Yes. Patterson looked out the window at his garden, where roses climbed a trellis in the late autumn sun. We failed her, he said quietly. Not the other way around. She did her job perfectly. We're the ones who didn't do ours. I returned to London and began piecing together the full scope of the operation. Using Claire's journals, the RAF reconnaissance photographs and German military records that had been declassified in recent decades, I reconstructed the timeline. July 1942. German command initiates Operation Sperrmittel, a deception program designed to reinforce Allied assumptions about Calais as the primary invasion threat. August 1942. Construction begins using French forced labor. Engineers create detailed plans based on RAF reconnaissance patterns. September 1942. First full aerial photographs capture the maturing deception. RAF intelligence interprets it as genuine German defensive preparation. October 1942. Claire Delacroix sends message to London. Message received but dismissed as unreliable. November 1942. May 1944. Deception site expanded and refined. Allied strategic planning increasingly focused on Calais. June 6, 1944. D-Day invasion launches at Normandy. German High Command holds reserves near Calais for crucial days. The operation had succeeded beyond expectations. Not because it was perfect, but because it told the Allies what they already believed. Delacroix Farm, near Calais, France, July 1942. Claire was hanging laundry when the German staff car arrived. She didn't run. Running drew attention. Instead, she continued pinning bedsheets to the line, her movement steady despite the fear climbing her spine. Two officers emerged from the car. One older, gray-haired, wearing the insignia of an engineering corps major. The other younger, carrying rolled papers that looked like architectural plans. Her father appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on his work trousers. Herr Delacroix, the major said in passable French, we require use of your southern fields for a project of military importance. What kind of project? That is not your concern. You will be compensated fairly. Your cooperation is expected. It wasn't a request. Claire watched from the clothesline as they unrolled the plans on the hood of their car. Her father studied them, his face unreadable. This shows buildings, he said carefully. But my fields are for crops. The buildings will be temporary. the major replied. Agricultural production will resume after the war. Claire's father glanced at her, a warning in his eyes. Stay quiet. Don't draw attention. But Claire moved closer, curiosity overriding caution. The plans showed structures that looked wrong. Buildings with no foundations. A railway that terminated in the middle of a field. A church positioned where no church should logically stand. This railway, her father said, pointing. Where does it connect? That is classified. The major rolled up the plans. Construction begins Monday. Workers will arrive at dawn. You and your family will not interfere. You will not speak of this to anyone. Understood? Understood. The officers left. Claire's father stood in the yard, staring at the southern fields, as if seeing them for the last time. Papa? Claire approached carefully. Go inside, Claire. What are they building? I don't know, and we're not going to ask. He turned to her, his face drawn. Listen to me carefully. Whatever they build here, we know nothing about it. We see nothing. We say nothing. Do you understand? But, do you understand? She nodded. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about those plans. The buildings with no foundations. The railway to nowhere. The deliberately wrong placement of structures. It looked less like construction and more like theater. On Monday morning, trucks arrived carrying workers. Frenchmen in worn clothes, guarded by German soldiers with rifles. They looked exhausted, defeated. Forced labor. Claire recognized one of them. Henri Rousseau, a carpenter from the village. His son Bernard sometimes played with the neighbor children. Henri met her eyes briefly as he climbed down from the truck. The look said everything. I have no choice. The construction began immediately. Claire watched from the farmhouse windows as wooden frames rose in the southern fields. Not real buildings, skeletal structures designed to be covered with canvas. She watched them stretch fabric over the frames and paint it to look like stone walls. Watched them install false windows with colored paper behind them to simulate stained glass. They were building facades, props, structures designed to look real from above but hollow from every other angle. By the end of the first week, a false village had emerged. Buildings that weren't buildings. A church that was just painted canvas stretched over lumber. A railway platform with no actual rail connection. Claire began taking notes. She wrote in code at first, using a system she and her brother had invented as children. Simple substitutions, nothing sophisticated but enough to disguise the content if someone found her journal. She documented everything, the number of workers, the types of materials used, the construction timeline, the patterns they were creating. And she began to understand. They were building something designed to be photographed from reconnaissance aircraft. Every element was oriented upward. The angles of roofs, the spacing of buildings, even the way they painted shadows on canvas to simulate depth when viewed from above. It was deception on a massive scale. In late August, the engineers brought new instructions. Claire was bringing water to her father in the fields when she overheard them discussing the next phase. The crops need to be replanted, one engineer said in German, not realizing Claire understood the language. Circular patterns. Fast-growing varieties that will photograph darker than the surrounding grain. What will that simulate? Another asked. Artillery emplacements. Recent construction, the kind of ground disturbance that indicates military activity. They were manipulating the very earth to create false evidence. Claire returned to the farmhouse and added this to her notes. August 28, 1942. They're not just building false structures, they're reshaping the landscape itself, creating patterns that will convince observers watching from above that this region is being militarized. But I see the workers. I see the hollow buildings. I know it's theater. By September, the false landscape was nearly complete. Claire watched reconnaissance planes pass overhead almost daily now. High-altitude flights, the aircraft barely visible, their cameras capturing everything below. She wondered what those photographs showed. Whether the analysts in London understood what they were seeing. Whether anyone suspected the truth. She doubted it. The deception was too thorough, too carefully constructed. From the ground you could see the seams, the painted canvas, the wooden frames, the staged elements. But from 20,000 feet through a camera lens, it would look absolutely real. One afternoon in early September, Claire was working in the vegetable garden when she noticed something unexpected. A reconnaissance plane passed overhead, lower than usual, its engine struggling. It was losing altitude, damaged perhaps, trying to make it back to England. She watched it disappear toward the coast and wondered if the pilot had seen anything unusual. If from that lower altitude, the deception might be visible. But the plane didn't return. And the next day, German engineers arrived with new instructions, tightening security around the site. That evening, Claire made a decision. She couldn't stay silent, not when she knew the truth, not when that truth might save lives. She made contact with a shopkeeper in the village she suspected of resistance connections. The conversation was carefully coded, oblique, feeling each other out for trust. "I need to send a message," Claire said quietly. "To London." The shopkeeper's face remained neutral. "That's a dangerous thing to say to the wrong person." "I know. That's why I'm saying it to you." A long pause. "What kind of message?" "The kind that could change how they see what's happening here." The shopkeeper studied her for a long moment, weighing risk against necessity. "Come back tomorrow, after dark. Use the back entrance." Claire returned the next night. The shopkeeper introduced her to a man named Antoine, gaunt and intense, who asked her careful questions about what she'd witnessed. She told him everything: the false buildings, the staged crops, the hollow church, the railway to nowhere. "They're building a deception," she said. "And every reconnaissance photograph is capturing exactly what the Germans want the Allies to see." Antoine listened without interrupting. "This message," he said finally, "if I transmit it, and the Germans trace it, everyone in this network dies, including you." "I know. Why risk it?" Claire thought of Henri Rousseau building fake structures at gunpoint, of the reconnaissance planes photographing lies, of analysts in London making strategic decisions based on false evidence. "Because if I don't, more people die anyway, just slower and further away." Delacroix Farm, near Calais, France, October 1942. The message was transmitted on October 16th, 3 days after Claire met Antoine. She didn't know when it happened or how. That was safer. The less she knew about the network's operations, the less she could reveal if captured. But she knew it had been sent when Antoine appeared at the farm 2 days later, his face grim. "It's done," he said quietly, standing in the shadow of the barn. "London received it. But you need to be careful now. The Germans will be looking." "How do you know they received it?" "We got confirmation. Brief acknowledgement. Nothing more." He paused. "And nothing about whether they believed it." Claire nodded. She'd done what she could. The rest was beyond her control. "What happens now?" "You disappear from our network. No more contact, no more messages. If they suspect you, we can't protect you." Antoine's eyes were hard but not unkind. "Go back to your normal life. Be invisible." She tried. For 3 weeks, Claire worked the farm, avoided the construction site, kept her head down. She burned her coded notes page by page, feeding them into the kitchen stove until nothing remained but ash. But the Germans were watching. She noticed it first in small ways. A car that passed the farm too often. A soldier who lingered near the village church when she went to market. Questions from neighbors about whether she'd seen anything unusual. Someone had informed, or the Germans were simply being thorough, investigating everyone connected to the deception site. On December 8th, they came for her. It was early morning, still dark. Claire was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the vehicles. Her father looked at her across the table, his face pale. "Run," he whispered. But there was nowhere to run. The house was surrounded. The Gestapo officer who entered was young, polite, almost apologetic. "Mademoiselle Delacroix, you will come with us for questioning." "About what?" "That will be discussed at headquarters." They allowed her to dress, to take a coat. Her mother stood in the doorway, crying silently. Her father's hands were clenched into fists. "I'll be back soon," Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. She wasn't. The interrogation lasted 3 days. They didn't beat her at first. They asked questions, reasonable questions. "When did you first notice the construction? Who did you speak to about it? Did anyone ask you to gather information?" Claire answered carefully. Yes, she'd noticed the construction. It was impossible not to notice. No, she hadn't spoken to anyone about it. Why would she? It was German military business. But they knew she was lying. On the third day, they brought in a different officer. Older. Harder. "We know you sent a message to London," he said flatly. "We intercepted resistance communications. We know someone in this region warned the British about our operations. The only question is whether it was you. I don't know what you're talking about. Your family farm is at the center of the construction site. You had access. You had opportunity. And we have informants who say you asked questions about resistance networks." Claire said nothing. The beating started that afternoon. They wanted names. Who else was involved? Who transmitted the message? What other intelligence had she gathered? Claire gave them nothing. Not because she was brave, because she was terrified that if she started talking, she wouldn't be able to stop. After a week, they sent her to Ravensbrück. The camp was north of Berlin, a sprawling complex of barracks and workshops surrounded by electric fences. It held thousands of women, political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews, anyone the Reich deemed undesirable. Claire was assigned to a workshop making uniforms. 12-hour shifts, minimal food, brutal conditions. She survived by becoming invisible, by doing exactly what was ordered, by never drawing attention, by remembering her father's words. See nothing. Say nothing. The war continued around her. Through whispered conversations and smuggled news, she learned fragments. The Allies had invaded Italy. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Germany was losing. But in the camp, time moved differently. Days blurred into months. Seasons changed. Women died of disease, exhaustion, arbitrary execution. Claire held on. She held on because somewhere in London or Washington or wherever the message had gone, someone knew the truth about Calais. Someone knew the landscape was false, and maybe, just maybe, that knowledge would matter. In April 1945, the Guards abandoned the camp. Soviet forces arrived days later. Claire weighed 38 kilograms. Her hair was white despite being only 32 years old. Her hands shook constantly from nerve damage. But she was alive. The journey back to France took months. Displaced persons camps, Red Cross processing, slow trains through devastated countryside. She arrived at the farm in September 1945. Her parents had survived. The farm had survived. The false village in the southern fields was gone, dismantled, burned, erased, as if it had never existed. Her father embraced her without words. Her mother wept. And Claire stood in the kitchen where she'd been arrested and wondered if her message had mattered at all. If anyone had listened. If the truth she'd risked everything to tell had changed anything. She would never know for certain. But years later, after the full story of D-Day deception became public, after historians documented how German forces had remained concentrated around Calais, waiting for an invasion that never came, Claire understood. Her message hadn't stopped the deception, but it had been one voice among many, slowly building a case that something was wrong. One voice that refused to be silent, even when silence would have been safer. London, present day. 6 months after I began investigating the photograph, I published my findings. The article appeared in a major historical journal, accompanied by the reconnaissance image, Claire's journal entries, and analysis from Dr. Cartwright and Squadron Leader Patterson. The response was immediate. Historians contacted me with additional evidence. A German engineer's diary mentioning Project Calais, transport records showing materials shipped to the region, RAF flight logs confirming the reconnaissance patterns. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. A retired Bundeswehr officer named Klaus Richter emailed me with a subject line that made my hands shake. "My father designed the Calais deception." We spoke by phone the next day. "My father was Hauptmann Friedrich Richter," Klaus said. "Engineering Corps. He died in 1978, but I found his papers after my mother passed away last year. Detailed plans, photographs, operational reports about what he called the theater project. Would you be willing to share those documents? That's why I'm calling. I think people should know the full story, not just the Allied perspective, but what the Germans were trying to accomplish and why." Klaus sent me scans of his father's papers. They were extraordinary. Detailed architectural drawings showing how to construct buildings that would photograph as real from altitude, but used minimal materials. lighting studies calculating shadow angles at different times of day and year, crop selection guides identifying plants that would create the right contrast in black and white aerial photography, and a mission statement dated June 1942. Objective: create convincing evidence of major defensive preparation in Calais sector to fix Allied attention and resources on false invasion corridor. Success metric: enemy commitment of forces to counter phantom threat, reducing capacity for actual invasion elsewhere. It was brilliant, Klaus said. Terrible, but brilliant. My father understood that the Allies would trust their own reconnaissance more than any other intelligence source. So he gave them exactly what they expected to see. Did he know about the French resistance warnings? Yes. There's a memo from December 1942 acknowledging that resistance sources had identified the deception and transmitted warnings to London. But my father's assessment was that the warnings would be dismissed because they contradicted photographic evidence. He was right. I thought of Claire in her cell at Ravensbrück, not knowing whether her message had been received or believed. Your father's deception cost lives, I said carefully. The delay in German response to Normandy. The resources concentrated in the wrong place. I know, Klaus replied quietly. That's why I'm sharing this. Not to glorify what he did, but to document it, to show how easily truth can be buried under plausible lies. My father created a landscape of deception, but the real deception was making people believe their own eyes over the testimony of witnesses. We talked for an hour about the technical aspects of the operation, the psychology of deception, the ethics of documenting such things. Before we hung up, Klaus asked me a question. The woman who tried to warn London, Claire Delacroix, do you know if she ever learned that her message was received? I don't think so. She died in 1987. This story has only come to light now. That's a tragedy. Yes. A week later, I received another email. This one from a researcher at the National Archives in Washington. She'd found declassified OSS documents from 1943 showing that Claire's message, while initially dismissed, had eventually been added to a growing file of anomalous intelligence regarding Calais sector. By early 1944, that file had contributed to Allied planners' decision to treat Calais as a potential deception target, rather than assuming it was the primary invasion point. The message had mattered. Not immediately, not decisively, but as part of a cumulative case that something about Calais didn't add up. Claire's voice had been heard after all. I shared this with Marie, Claire's granddaughter. She wept when I told her. My grandmother never knew, she said. She spent 40 years believing she'd failed, believing her message had been ignored and her suffering had been for nothing. She didn't fail. Her testimony was part of what saved lives on D-Day. I wish she'd known that. So do I. Marie and I met one final time in Paris. She brought something she'd found while going through her grandmother's papers, a letter Claire had written in 1946, but never sent. It was addressed to whomever reads this someday. I don't know if my message reached London. I don't know if anyone believed me. I only know that I told the truth as I saw it, even when it was dangerous to do so. They built a landscape of lies in our fields. Photographed from above, it looked real, but I was on the ground. I saw the hollow buildings, the false railways, the staged activity, and I knew someone needed to know. So I spoke, and then I paid the price for speaking. But I would do it again, because truth matters more than safety, even when no one listens, even when it costs everything. Especially then. Marie handed me the letter. Keep this with the photograph, she said, so people understand what they're looking at. Not just a deception operation, but the cost of bearing witness to it. Paris, 6 months later. The photograph hangs in the Imperial War Museum now, in a special exhibition about deception operations of World War II. Beside it, Claire's journal, Bernard's testimony, the German engineering plans, Squadron Leader Patterson's analysis, and the letter she wrote but never sent. Together, they tell a story that goes beyond military strategy or tactical deception. They tell the story of what happens when truth becomes invisible, when seeing is no longer believing, when the most sophisticated lie is the one that confirms what people already think they know. I visited the exhibition on its opening day. Marie was there, standing before the photograph of her grandmother's fields, reading the placard that explained what visitors were seeing. This 1942 reconnaissance photograph shows a false landscape constructed by German forces to deceive Allied intelligence. Every element, buildings, railways, crop patterns, was designed to be photographed from altitude and misinterpreted as genuine military preparation. One woman, Claire Delacroix, witnessed the deception being built and risked her life to warn Allied command. Her message was received but initially dismissed. Only later did it contribute to the recognition that Calais was a deception target. She survived Ravensbrück concentration camp and returned to France in 1945. She died in 1987, never knowing whether her message had mattered. It did. A young student stood beside Marie, studying the photograph with intense concentration. "I don't understand," the student said. "If she told them it was fake, why didn't they believe her?" "Because," Marie said gently, "they trusted what they could see more than what they were told. The photograph looked real. Her testimony contradicted it. So they dismissed her. That seems stupid." "It does. But it's human. We believe our eyes. We trust technology. And sometimes that trust is exactly what makes us blind." The student moved on. Marie turned to me. "Do you think people will learn from this?" "I don't know. I hope so. My grandmother used to say that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with words and silence, knowing when to speak and when to listen." Marie touched the glass protecting the photograph. She chose to speak, even when no one wanted to listen. I thought about all the hours I'd spent researching this story, the archives, the interviews, the slow reconstruction of truth from fragments, and I realized what this photograph really showed. Not just a false landscape, but the distance between seeing and understanding, between evidence and truth, between what we're shown and what actually is. The exhibition will run for 6 months. Thousands of people will see the photograph. Most will read the placard and move on, but some will stop. Some will look closer. Some will ask, "What else am I seeing wrong? What other truths am I missing because I trust the surface too much?" And maybe that's the real lesson. Not about World War II, not about deception operations, but about the eternal human struggle to see clearly, to question what we think we know, to listen to voices that contradict our certainties. Claire stood in those fields 80 years ago and saw through the lie. She spoke truth to power. She paid the price for it. And decades later, we finally heard her. Some photographs capture more than they show. They hold questions that take generations to answer, and voices that refuse to be silenced, even by time itself.